També ha estat membre de la Comissió Científica d'Europan des dels seus inicis i també va establir el 1989 l'equip de projecte d'urbanisme, un departament de recerca i de desenvolupament de la Universitat de la Beina, implicat en la reestructuració d'àrees industrials abandonades i de ports abandonats i ferroviaris abandonats. Actualment la investigació de Smets es centra principalment en el paisatge i la infraestructura i està aquí a Barcelona convidat com a president del jurat del segon Premi Manuel de Solà-Morales, que organitza el Laboratori d'Urbanisme de l'Escola d'Arquitectura de Barcelona i que aquesta és la seva segona edició i en la que el col·legi t'ha col·laborat. També ens acompanya el Joan Busquets, que ja us he dit que és persona estimada, arquitecte, professor de molts de nosaltres, però que a més ha marcat i que està donant ara classes a Harvard. I el que hem tingut ocasió de parlar amb el Marcel és que Marcel vous donnerez ici aujourd'hui une nouvelle conférence spéciale pour Barcelona i que esperem que ens agradi molt a tots i je vous remercie de venir ici a la Maison des Architectes. Igualment en Joan Busquets. Gràcies.
Molt bé. Moltes gràcies, senyora Degana, per la introducció. Si nosaltres tenim l'objectiu de fer aquesta conferència el mateix dia que es dona el Premi amb una tesi doctoral, que és el Premi conegut Manuel Solà-Morales, que aquesta, com sabeu, és la segona edició, i ens agrada molt que el president del jurat tingui l'ocasió també d'explicar una mica la seva recerca més interessant i comunicar-la d'una manera extesa. Tot això pensant que també aquestes recerques, siguin de doctorat o sigui de professors interessats en el doctorat, com és el cas de Marcel Smets, obre el camp i permet també donar altres mirades en els objectes que normalment tractem. Moltes vegades com a professionals tendim a concentrar-nos més en la solució dels problemes que tenim plantejats, però moltes vegades aquesta mirada que la recerca dona ens pot ajudar a tots. Només per complementar la presentació que la senyora Degana ja ha fet de Marcel Smets, volia dir, a part que és un vell amic de l'escola, del laboratori, personal també, és una persona també que té una trajectòria molt interessant des del punt de vista també del projecte urbà i del disseny urbà a Europa. Segurament una dimensió que pocs potser coneixem, però la primera mirada, el primer coneixement del Marcel Smets va ser el seu treball de tesis quan ell es va dirigir a un període històric molt determinat de finals del XIX, amb Charles Bull, amb un alcalde amb pretensions d'urbanista que feia una mirada a la ciutat diferent. Això, probablement una tesi de fa 30 anys, era molt interessant veure directament aquesta idea de que la història urbana es reflectia en els agents que fan la gestió de la ciutat. Em sembla que pensar una mica que la inversió del disseny de la ciutat té que veure també amb agents que fan possible sigui la direcció de la ciutat, però també el management de la ciutat, em sembla que és una cosa que ell, ja des d'un treball molt acadèmic inicial, ja va posar sobre la taula i em sembla que això és una dimensió a vegades menys coneguda del Marcel, però que jo aprecio moltíssim. Com he dit abans, és una persona molt coneixedora de Barcelona, ha estat aquí moltes vegades, ha seguit molt les feines que s'han fet tant a la ciutat com en l'escola, com en els projectes, i per tant també ens va semblar amb el Josep Parcerissa i el Carles Crosses que tenia sentit amb la segona edició del jurat que ell fos el líder del jurat i així ha sigut. Per tant, jo crec que aquesta dimensió, diguéssim, d'una persona que tot tenint en compte la seva trajectòria des de la història urbana, però tenim molt present quina és la gestió de la història, que probablement és el que ens interessa més als arquitectes i als urbanistes, em sembla que aquesta era una sortida intel·lectual molt interessant que el Marcel Smets, des d'una visió molt des de Bèlgica, va tenir. La seva trajectòria a la universitat és contínua i forta, porten allà els cursos de doctorat, però també de disseny urbà, però després té una altra dimensió que em sembla no menor, que ha sigut durant molts anys l'arquitecte de l'Estat. Per tant, en aquest sentit, una figura que en els països del nord existeix, que vol dir un arquitecte que pren la responsabilitat de que totes les accions que l'Estat va fer, hi ha algú que les supervisa, o que les encamina, o que diu això heu de fer concurs, això heu de fer ja. Per tant, hi ha una visió orientada, clara, i em sembla que això és una que moltes vegades ens faria molta ajuda si a nivell també nostre això fos més clarament marcat, que vol dir un compromís d'orientació disciplinar de les accions que l'Estat fa sobre les escoles, els habitatges, les transformacions de barris, etc. I aquí em sembla que el Marcel Smets va posar un esforç que jo m'agrada molt també fer constar. Gràcies, Marcel. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Joan. This is a place where I understand Catalan, especially when you talk about me. And I would like to add that maybe, and it's one of the nice things that you remember, that you highlight in this introduction, and I would like to return the ball, you know. I think we belong to a generation that has never considered urbanism just as only design, but also as an intellectual trajectory of history, and also, as you did with the Olympics, you know, influencing the decision-making, trying to do well for the society. And I think this is a very important element also of what I'm going to try and talk about later, but it's a very generational thing also. So thank you very much for highlighting that. Thank you very much for being here. I feel very honored to speak in this room or in this building, because as Joanna's pointed out, Barcelona has been always extremely on my mind, as the song says, and I have many friends and masters here of whom I pay tribute to, because many of the thoughts are also part of them. So I started this picture and also the poster that you saw with this picture of the Leuven project in the beginning, in the early phases. The phases of what Ignacy de Solà-Morales would call you know, the terrain vague, the moment that nothing yet is settled and that everything is only hope. And so for me this is also important, because this is maybe the moment that is, for a project, one of the most interesting. Many of you know that I have had the honor of being entrusted, when I was teaching at the University of Leuven, by the city, you know, the reconversion plan of a large area around involving the station, but much more than the station. And this plan involved, you know, a study in the first phase, and then a more detailed commission later. And the reason why I bring it up is because I would like to start my argument with explaining from what it comes. And it comes basically from a personal experience. The experience I had also with Joan, when I remember that we talked about this project in a very early phase when you came to teach at our university, and later with Manuel. What I want to illustrate is very practical. You know, the thing was on a large scale and a medium scale, and then on a very detailed scale involving the passage under the tracks, and also the place where the bus station was going to find a sort of a new hall to the city, a new entry. But at the same time, we never really solved certain issues. Actually, as you see, this idea of the square in front of the station is too divided. And there are other things that I could mention. So when the new mayor came to office and we were sort of managing the whole operation, I had, I think, one of the best ideas that I've ever had in my life is to involve Manuel in this adventure. I had known Manuel from the Antwerp studies, where I was his outside critic. And actually, what happened in the situation was that Manuel was able to solve a number of issues that, in effect, we had never addressed. And I think this is where you recognize a certain mastership, is when you know a project by heart and you know that there is an invention which is done which you hadn't thought about. And the invention had to do with the fact of how do you link the city at the same time while you have to pass the major throughway, and how do you make a parking accessible from all sides, both entry and exit, and you make it as a connection in times of rainy weather between the passage under the rails and the city. And this simple, rather, looks simple, but the simple idea of making the tunnel go to -2, which allows a parking to be sort of a bridge above it, was really like what they say, the egg of Columbus. So I would like to start this lecture by illustrating just a few points out of this project of Leuven, a few points that I think merit to commemorate because I recognized afterwards, are part of a larger story. One of the elements is that, which Manuel taught me, was that there is a layered situation, and that you can exploit programmatic complexity in order to create a number of fascinating layers. For instance, the passage, and it's very often the section that is becoming important, you know. The entry in the city, which is at the same time a part of the parking, the tunnel, which becomes part of the parking with the entry and the exit, the bus station that is related to this entry, the fact that the bus station at the same time rests on the parking, and by doing that you need a certain grid, etc. All of these kind of elements of the underneath and the upside, and all of this being thought together as in a sort of a layered way. The other point is, for instance, the fact that the alignment and the topography are really forming the site. The idea of the linearity, which made, for instance, that the direction of the bus building, which we had initially planned, became turned so that the direction of the site would be more unilateral. Also, the fact of creating a new building typology that accentuates the character of the site. Of course, when you make a building that closes a square that never existed before as such, and divides the public square into the buses here and the public square there, you have an angle. And of course, I don't have to tell you how the angles were important for Manuel and Solà-Morales, but this angle is also pronounced by this larger roof, while the opening in the building portrays the idea of the train that enters into the square. The idea that the center should be empty in order by making uses and creating activities all around it, and by continuing the idea of the terraces to keep something of the terrain vague idea in the middle. And then, of course, the idea that a tunnel or a road is not just a tunnel. It is an architectural item. It is a promenade. It becomes something through which you move and whereby the movement each time is a pleasure. And it creates, of course, a sort of landscape of its own. The fact that a parking, which is by definition in this case, because it's has different levels, the ground floor moves, so it becomes an artificial topography. But this topography, how do you create unity? And the unity, of course, is with the roof. And the roof that is just underlined by these kind of champignon pillars is what is creating all the kind of unity. The bus station, on the other hand, whereby you have the movement in itself going up and down, etc., and you need, in order to master that movement, a sort of permanence, a sort of dignity and a timely permanence in time, whereby, you know, when there is no buses, you can still confront the elements. And where there is a dike, so that you can look on the spectacle of the movement. And then, very important, in my opinion, the fact that you have to consider the urban project at what Johan called the intermediate scale, and the scale which is of a size that is enough that you can still master it, and that it in itself can be is a sort of a self-sustaining piece that transforms afterwards the neighborhood. And in this case, it's nice to see how this self-sustaining piece was when it was delivered in 2002, and how it leads to a development that is now more or less completed 16, 17 years later. And above all, you know, the fact that industrial design is something that you, infrastructural design is something whereby you can refine the public landscape. So I wanted to very quickly give this overview in order to try and explain a sort of a personal motivation. A personal motivation of two, in my mind, very important things. One, the acute awareness of the prominence of infrastructure today, both in public investment and in city making. When we think about also allowing finances, etc., we see that infrastructure is basically that what always still can get money. So we have to use it in order to make a city today, and this is something I became extremely aware of with the Leuven project and with working with Manuel. And the second was what I tried to say when I talked about the egg of Columbus and the parking which he designed, is a sort of a fascination for design intelligence expressed in projects that seem to succeed in solving problems of an utmost complexity by doing very simple things that resolve everything. So I tried to pursue that afterwards. In my own career, it's not the place to go into that, but okay, just for the record, I'm involved in many infrastructural projects at the moment still. But also in terms of research. The last book that I published together with Kelly Shannon was exactly about this idea of getting to know how contemporary infrastructure forms our landscape today. And what I tried to do in that book, what we tried to do, is to identify the design attitudes which prevail today in the design of infrastructure, and choose representative projects throughout the world that identify these kind of attitudes. Now, I don't want to go in it, but there are in the book 4 contemporary paradigms with relation to designing infrastructure. The first is to hide the intervention, to avoid conflict and leave the existing environment untouched. We will come back to it at the end of the lecture. The second is to exploit the constructive rationality as a source of beautifying the object and detach the infrastructure from its setting, the infrastructure as the beautiful object. The third is, well, let's take the fourth. The fourth is that the effects of mobility are structuring the landscape today. By accessibility, mobility creates accessibility, accessibility creates market value, and we have the tall skyscrapers in the most accessible points. But the third element, and I want to come back to that, is to consider the making of infrastructure as an opportunity to review the existing environment and to integrate its design in an encompassing transformation project of the urban realm. And these are some of the projects that I illustrate in the book and that I particularly like because of that. Because each time we have this kind of layered ambition of creating an encompassing landscape through the relatively through an intervention of infrastructure. In this project made by OMA in The Hague is, this is just a tram station. It's the station under one of the main shopping streets. And actually the station, which you know probably, is also a parking space, is also an exhibition room, and so forth. And it is a very complex, simple project that changes many things at the same time. In Breda, Westacht and OMA really configured, the area of the roof of the parking together as the urban square, and one and the other are completely intermixed. I think this fantastic project by Wassi and Manfredi in Seattle, which links the high city with the sea, the high city, the higher part of the city with the sea, where there was a number of infrastructural, road, trains, and so forth, as it always goes along major seaboards or lakeboards. We have these infrastructural barriers, and they overcame it by, creating a sort of complex promenade up to a museum, and leaving the infrastructure. You see it here, and you see the road also here. And there the road, etc. So the infrastructure is left, existing infrastructure is left untouched, and at the same time you have this fantastic idea of linking the one with the other and seeing the sea all the time, But also, for instance, this project in Paris of, the Boulevard Paris by Patrick Duguay. It's a sort of a 5-kilometer long stretch of a new motorway in the periphery of the Parisian banlieue, but really already with the individual houses and so forth. Very, very unordered sort of situation, as you know, in many cities like this. And the idea of creating a very complex infrastructure with very interesting sections that become sometimes balconies and that give way to berm landscapes and to walls and so forth, depending on the situation along, clearly makes that the road which is there becomes an element of enriching the environment as we know it. And instead of being a barrier, it becomes something to complete and to give a sort of sense of belonging, in a way, a central point to this peripheral development around it. And you know, when I looked at these examples, and I looked at this third category, and I remembered what I learned from Manuel, and I started to look a little bit closer, I'm wondering, and this is a sort of an assertion that I would like to make tonight, whether this model of fusion is not something that you as a community have invented. Whether we cannot speak about a Barcelona model. All of these examples are characterized by a number of very few but essential things. They all deal with the creation of a new, inclusive type of infrastructure that is responding to the characteristics of its particular setting, of its particular environment. It is not imposing, but it is working with the environment by creating a new, inclusive typology. It's establishing a rather traditional type of pedestrian-oriented, urban-like space. It's not the sort of fascination of cars that go about. No, it's the fascination of the pedestrian and of the citizen, of the urbanite. It's not denying the existence of movement, but it's recognizing its role as a constituent part of contemporary urban life, and it's domesticating the movement by making the project. That's a very important attitude. It's not just separating, it's working with, it's integrating, it's accepting the reality of modernity with relation to transport and movement. And the fourth, it's creating what I call the hybrid landscape of fusion, related to infrastructure design, but combining transport and movement with park and civil enjoyment. And okay, if we accept this, why do I think it is to be brought back to Barcelona and to a certain tradition? I've enumerated 4 important prototypical examples throughout your recent design history and your going on with infrastructure. And I would like to argue that these iconic examples, and I call them iconic because they have been traveling throughout the world as examples, have also this emblematic character which I just tried to sketch out. Of course, I think the Mall de la Fusta is the basis. I think it's the first time, I think, in the recent history of cities that we had this kind of an effort whereby your 8 lanes of motorway that were passing along the old city have been completely changed into something that is new, because I called it a perforated dike, extending the old town to the harbor, and creating a situation whereby, of course, you have the extension of the old town with a local traffic situation. Then you have a situation of one underneath and one not underneath, whereby, and the parking, and then the long promenade along the marina and the sea. So it is actually a completely new situation, which is based or was based on the transversal section, which was so keen, what I just said, to create something that is an extension of the town, and by organizing local movement. And then the through way is sort of hidden, and at the same time not, because it's passing in one direction, but at the same time it's creating a roof and a parking, and on the roof you have the dike, and you get this fantastic kind of public space, which at the time was a double-layered public space, one on top, one here, with the, well, I remember it when the restaurants were there and when it was the place to be seen. I understand that not everything works out as it is planned, but that's another discussion. The second example, I think, by Roichem Battle, the node of Trinidad, is also in a way very clear, because it is an existing motorway, but by what is being done, it is not just like many landscape architects try to do something to beautify an existing road. It is giving, in my opinion, a new significance to this idea of the road by notably joining two elements, you know, the junction, whereby you have the passage from one part, from Trinidad to the other part of the city, and under the motorways here and so forth. This idea of creating a junction at the local level, of creating actually an urban park in a sort of an extension of the existing streets and the existing dwellings, and yet as you go further into the node, create something that is a park of itself, of its own, and has manifestly a form that is determined not only by the nous, by the node, but also by the site and by the differentiation in topography and levels that you have in it. And thirdly, but importantly, it is not denying the existence of traffic. It's creating a sort of hybrid landscape in which the traffic also plays a role and becomes a part. We could say the same thing for a more moderate, but also I think very much published, the Parque de la Solidaridad in Llobregat by Godia and Casas, and you know, it's in a way it's a covering, of course, of the Ronda de Alto, the motorway, and it's a junction because of that of two quarters, of two districts. Yet, what is interesting about it is that it's also creating a new typology, because actually it's a sort of roundabout again, you know, but the roundabout is inside, becomes a park. So because of that, you get a situation whereby the traffic as it is still possible, the car traffic is existing, but it becomes an important element that is joining the two elements together, whereas of course it is relatively moderate in its distance, so the motorway can still pass. And this idea of linkage while existing with the traffic is extremely well, and I would say rather iconically expressed, notably by this passage, but also by the railing, by the lighting, and so forth. This idea of something that becomes exceptional, and because of that, gets its value. And the last that I would try to point at is the Gran Via by Andrea Ariola and Carmen Fiol. And there also, I think, when you see what happened with the Gran Via and what you see how it was transformed, I think it's an interesting, a really interesting example of the domestication of car passage, domestication of movement in terms of gaining public neighborhood, making encounters, making this kind of a park. And I think this drawing that they made is very illustrative of the purpose, you know. This, only the gray element is still really traffic, whereas all the rest of this enormously invading section is becoming something else. It's not just a park, it's a hybrid of something that has never existed before, because it's at the same time, of course, also because of the section, again the section. It is with these cantilevers and with the noise barriers that are made there, and you know, the tramway that is accessible from this side, from the local roads, etc. You get into this marvelous situation of this hybrid landscape that becomes a surprisingly public space and is rather unique in its genre. And all of these, for examples, I hope they're all in Barcelona, obviously. They are all by different architects. And so, in my opinion, they transfigure an attitude, a way of dealing with infrastructure, a way of considering it, which I think is extremely valuable, or has been extremely valuable in a part of our time. And of course, I want to go relatively quick here because we could keep on enumerating examples. It is clear that this attitude is not just the 4 iconic examples that I mentioned. They have had their influence. They have exerted an influence over a real period of time, as well in the projects that have been done in Barcelona itself, as well as in the projects that have been done by Barcelonese architects abroad. So in Barcelona, for instance, I think it's clear that the Ronda del Litoral, for instance, is something that works also with this section, whereby the consideration is how can we make a road that is basically something that the road becomes part of a whole environment in a way. It's not only about crossing the road, it's the road itself that becomes part of a new landscape. And I think that goes also for the Ronda de Alt, in the sense that, of course, the design commission is very different because the topography is different and we're not flat, but we are with the, you know, in a mountainous situation, so we are basically in something that is dug into the land. And so this digging into the land is resolved in such a way that it becomes an accumulation of scenic views, always constituting, you know, going on with the infrastructure in such a way that it highlights not only the traffic and the movement, but like it's very clear in this kind of pictures, you know, the emphasizes the environment, creates a spot to lose your breath in a way. And okay, then just to case a few examples. When you look at Manuel's project in Malaga, for instance, it's also again about the section, but it's also again about how do we configure a parking that is at the same time a public space, you know, and how this gives new kind of landscapes. Or I would really want to also mention here the Johan's project of the Grotiusplatz in The Hague, which in my view is also exceptional because it is basically making 2 buildings which are bridging the, I forget, the A25, I think it is anyway, the Utrechtsbaan, the motorway, but at the same time, these bridges are open. And why are they open? Because you have to be able to have local traffic there and the local traffic identifies the court of justice, which is there, but since we don't have enough space to make the whole, because of course the space here is limited, we sort of cantilever it, and we create a sort of an illusion that the road is no longer there and that this becomes a real place of a new nature, of course. Again, a sort of a hybrid landscape, which actually we don't know before. And maybe also Manuel's last project in Antwerp, where, you know, the creation of a pavement of 40 meters before the Opera House, by concentrating all access to the new tram station that is planned there, which also connects to a parking and so forth, creates at the same time something above that is of a new sort of space or place to be done. So, what I try to illustrate, in my opinion, is that there is a tradition of working with infrastructure, which is particular, has been evolved and throughout a number of examples in this city, that it has also been very influential in other projects. And I would like to end my talk with asking questions, because in my opinion we are now faced with another situation more and more. And I think that the prevailing design conception gets to be much more rather divide than integrate. And that the what I called the Barcelona model is becoming questioned. And so I think its worldwide influence that it had at a certain moment is slowly disappearing. And in my opinion, there is a number of reasons for that, which of course go beyond architecture or urbanism, that have to do with changing cultural and political stance. The first, in my opinion, and very important, is the gradual loss of strong political leadership. And with it, the continuity of an authority over longer periods, required by planning and by the implementation of major interventions in infrastructure or urban development. I mean, the times that we had mayors, and I'm not talking only of Monsieur Marc, I'm talking about mayors throughout, in many cities, that lingered on and were able to, you know, to sustain a long-taken continuity, because it was not questioned, is more and more over in most countries in Europe. The second is an attitude of, I think, also with our, with many of our younger colleagues, perhaps, is an attitude of taking for granted, of matter-of-factness, that is replacing the drive for improving society that pushed a certain generation, and that I think especially in Spain it was the generation, of course, after Franco, that pushed a generation to experiment and innovation. Now things become more evident, more clear, more matter-of-fact, and it's not something you want to devote your life to. It's a profession. The third thing is the growing attention, I think, to issues of health, safety, and climate, and the effects motorized traffic exerts on them. We should not deny that this is becoming a very paramount issue amongst the population. And the thing that goes along with it is the steady growth of local activism and decision-taking delegated to action groups, residents gaining importance, of local incidents over general benefits, of social and ecological consequences over and economic impact. And when we look at these elements, I think we see that there is a resulting change in the design attitude towards infrastructure. First of all, there is a re-evaluation of individually motorized traffic in the mobility chain. And that clearly inspires an altered view of the car. The car gets to be the enemy of common well-being, certainly in urban settings. For that reason, its unfortunately still necessary presence has to be hidden. Parkings have to go underground. Motorways have to go in tunnels. Throughways have to be covered. Design commissions get to be split up. Our decision makers don't have no more time for intricately complex processes of integrating infrastructure in its surroundings. Public clients now rather opt for a clear separation between the organizing effective flows in the underground, on the one hand, and produce attractive and suitable embellishment on the ground level. And consequently, and I think it's important to note that in this building, which is professionally the building that supports architects, the position of the architect and the urban designer gets endangered. Design commissions of major infrastructures are no longer entrusted to them, but go to large engineering firms on the one side and to landscape architects on the other. The engineering firms have to see that everything flows quickly, underground, not noticeable, but effective, and the landscape architect should decorate what is above. Of course, this kind of new attitude has been there for a certain time, but I think it's getting different. There are precedents of covering, of tunneling, which also I noted in our book, for instance. This is a very famous case of a 6-kilometer tunnel for the high-speed train under the so-called Green Heart of Holland. Very costly because of the water and the dikes, but it was done in order to preserve a planning idea. And this goes back now, this decision, 15 years. This motorway in Switzerland has been developed like this in order to preserve the existing landscape. In situations of countries with a lot of money, it existed before. It also existed, like this famous example of the A1 in Paris, in order to heal disruptive effects that were exerted by major throughways, mostly made in the 60s. But you see, of course, the difference between this and the Gran Via. Here, it's just, okay, we will just cover it. In the Gran Via, it is a coexistence between the two. Here, it is the engineers that made the underground, and it is Michel Courajou, the landscape architect, who designed what was on top. The Big Dig in Boston, relatively well known, a very long, elevated motorway, which was finally, after years and years, put into a tunnel, a very vast tunnel, and then, years later, without having an existing contract at the beginning, some landscape architects were charged to do the above ground. And should I add one of the most famous examples, which you have in your own country, the Rio Trenta project in Madrid. A little different than the others because one and the other was created at the same time, but still it's clearly a project of covering and of, let's say, landscape architecture above, with all the value that it may have. So what I'm trying to say is these things already existed. What I see now is an inflation of these kind of things for many, many different purposes. One is, for instance, in this example in Hamburg, in Germany, you see it's just covering the motorway in a part of something that is, let's say, residential outskirts of the city in order to have less problems for the vicinity. We will cover parts so that we have this kind of new residential quality which is attained. All of these are, of course, not yet realized. They are very new. They are just images, SketchUps. The second example, rather known, is the Ville-Marie in Montreal, which was an important competition between landscape architects, nota bene, not architects, in order to cover an important part of the boulevard that was passing in the central part of town, and whereby, this environment would benefit from the coverage and from making this kind of new landscaped environment. Another famous example is in Tel Aviv, in Israel, where you see this project for a very long covering of the Ayalon highway. And when you look at the prospective vision, you can clearly see what is the main aim, is to increase the real estate value along the sides of this new coverage, so that you can make a sort of new Manhattan in Tel Aviv. A very homogeneous town, as you may know, for the rest of it. Or in Antwerp, the coverage of the ring motorway with an ambition of making a vast linear park. This is the drawing from the action groups, by the way. This is the drawing of the officially appointed design agency. But they come down to similar ideas, trying to create a sort of vast linear park to join city and periphery. Now, all of these examples reoccur, and do away with a certain attitude which I think was rather valuable. And I would like to end with pointing at the fact that the most clear example of this change is probably in your own city, where, you had this very modernist, you had this very modernist kind of an attitude by Areola and Fiol, the Plaza de las Glorias, which was this kind of elevated roundabout with the major intention of creating an urban space in the middle which would be accessible through porticos from all sides, but which would also, by making the roundabout, create this kind of unique image on iconic buildings which you wanted to, which you have realized along its course. And when I see this, and I see that now this is to be replaced by another kind of, I don't know the exact status and how decided it is. I only saw that it was published by the municipality as a new vision. And when I see this vision, I discover also the idea of separating and realizing something on top that is rather unrelated to what is happening underneath. And I think by seeing these attitudes evolve throughout the world, for reasons that I try to explain, at least which would be my opinion, we are also losing something which was invented in this town. Thank you very much. If you want, we can have this one. Maybe it's not the tradition in this house.
Thank you very much for your very enlightening, complex lecture. I would just like to thank you for your very inspiring and very rich lecture and for explaining the wealth of the Barcelona model of urbanism. What I don't fully get in your argumentation is your precise reasoning why you think that that sort of urban lobotomy between the park and the traffic infrastructure is something that you consider poor. I mean, of course, it's less complex. It sort of seals the motorway, the car away. And I can somehow see your argument, but maybe I wasn't sort of listening attentively enough to really get your reasoning why you think this is a loss of integrating the car into the visual and the sensitive aspect of the city.
Maybe I've expressed, I'm very sorry, thank you very much for your observation. I didn't want to express it as a loss in itself, because I think that we are always children of our times, you know, and that it is logic that we get other solutions than 20 years ago. So I don't think we have to evaluate in terms of loss or gain. What I tried to, when I spoke about loss, it was a loss of a certain model, you know, of a certain way of thinking, which I think was very particular and very rich, and very architectural and very modern, and dealing with the complexity of the city in a very hybrid way, you know, integrating the elements that were part of the problem, or trying to integrate them. Whereas now, I think we do not longer believe in that. We, as a population, especially the decision makers, we tend to highlight, as I said, you know, the four examples that we made, you know, the iconic examples of Barcelona, we can all make the issue that they are not scoring very well on health issue, that they are not scoring extremely well on, you know, on all elements that are now on safety, you know, road safety and so forth. You know, when you drive in the Ronda de Alt, you have to be a very good chauffeur, you know, and so forth. You know, it's boom, 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 and so on. Okay, so it may be fascinating, but it's not your regular. In Northern Europe, this road would not be permitted anymore, you know, because of road safety regulations that oblige you to have 150 meters of entry, mixing, and so forth. You know. What I'm trying to say is that this kind of richness, which is an attitude of trying to resolve all things at the same time while being fascinated with movement. I think movement is one of the constituent pillars of modernity, you know. And of course we are no longer, this is also in a way a regret that the modern tradition is gone, in a way, you know. It's like we make it simple, you know. We divide, and the issue is solved. Now I'm portraying it too simply, but it's different, you know. It's it makes me think suddenly of the spatial landings. There was a time when it was extremely difficult. One of the major projects with the moon landing was how to land softly on the moon, you know, so they had to invent all things with rockets and parachutes that came in at the last moment and so forth. You know how the moonlander in Mars was loved? It was just dropped, bam, you know, and then it was strong enough to sustain the dropping, and then it sort of popped open. So that's the same attitude, you know, it's a sort of, how do you solve everything, or how do you be clear, practical? That's what I meant, matter of fact, taking for granted, practical. And it's less ideological. So in a way, it's not a loss in terms of, sorry for my long answer, of regret. It's in terms of trying to illustrate it's another epoch.
I appreciated your talk very much. I'm visiting from Montreal, and I find your talk very timely. It's quite interesting that there's an area in Montreal called the Turcotte Yards. Maybe you're familiar with it. It's a north-south, east-west division. It goes back to 1967, or just about. Just before Expo 67, and it was modeled, the freeway was modeled after what was done in LA. That's what I see when I see it. It's falling apart because it's reinforced concrete, and in an environment in Montreal that just doesn't go very far. So it's falling apart because of salt infiltration. The road surface is falling apart, so the government had to do something about this, and so the Turcotte Yards are going more at the ground level with a park, sort of a bridge park between two communities. And so what you're talking about is really, I think, very to the point, that there's a change in attitude about this. And there's been a conflict between the provincial government in Quebec City and the local community groups in Montreal. The Department of Transport in Quebec City, centered in Quebec City, is having to hear what community groups want in Montreal. So it's quite interesting what's going on right now.
Yeah, I know a little bit better the Toronto case where they have a similar situation.
Gardner Expressway, yes.
Okay, I don't want to make it longer than it needs to be, and it was just a thought opener, so maybe we can reflect later about it, you know. We don't always have to reflect on the moment itself. Thank you very much again for asking me.